Marta Yoder never once asked for the goats, and she certainly never asked for 71 acres of county land that nobody, in 11 long years of trying, had managed to sell. But both of them arrived on the same afternoon, in a single stack of paperwork she had not expected to sign that year. Her uncle Ezra had signed up for the county's conservation grazing lease 2 full years before he died. One of a handful of local goat keepers willing to run their herds on tax-forfeited land the county could not unload at any price. Land so choked with briar and multiflora rose and wild blackberry. Cane that a surveyor sent out to walk the boundary the year before had turned back after 4 exhausting hours, having covered less than half the parcel and returning with both arms scratched raw above the wrist. When Ezra passed, the lease and the herd came to Marta, along with the rest of his modest estate. A piece of paperwork she had signed mostly out of a sense that refusing felt disrespectful to a man who had raised her through 2 very difficult teenage years after her own parents' divorce. Years she still thought about more than she talked about openly with anyone. Nobody in Rockingham County thought much about it either way. Not really. The land had been sitting there, unsellable and mostly forgotten, since before most people could remember exactly why. Passed from one county budget line to the next, without anyone ever quite deciding what to do about it, and a woman running 40 goats on it, instead of letting it sit fallow, did not strike anybody as remarkable enough to comment on, one way or the other. She was simply doing what her uncle had done, and her uncle had simply been doing what the county had quietly hoped somebody, anybody, would agree to do with ground nobody else wanted. She had not read anything about clearing brush with livestock before she started any of it. She learned it entirely by watching her own animals, week after week, ignore the open grass strips along the fence line entirely, in favor of standing on their hind legs to reach the thorniest, highest bramble cane they could find, eating straight through vegetation that would have torn a person's hands to shreds without a single visible hesitation, working the thorns the way another animal might work a favorite treat. 2 years into running that lease from her uncle, in the lowest, wettest corner of the property, where the briar had grown thickest of all, a hard spring rain washed the last loose cover off a shape Marta's goats had already stripped bare of every leaf and cane, and there, half sunk into the hillside, stood a small stone springhouse nobody living in that county had any memory of. If stories about overlooked land, patient work, and history hiding under what everybody else had already given up on completely mean something to you, subscribe and join our farming family. And tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from tonight, wherever that happens to be. We would love to know how far this story has traveled across the world. Rockingham County sits in the heart of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, ground settled heavily by German and Swiss farming families beginning in the 1700s. Families who built in stone the way their own grandparents had built in the old country. Barns and springhouses and foundation walls, meant to outlast whoever laid the first course by a margin of centuries rather than decades. A springhouse was, before refrigeration existed anywhere at all, outside a block of ice hauled in by wagon, one of the most important buildings on a working farm. A small structure built directly over or immediately beside a natural spring, so the cold, steady flow of groundwater could keep milk, butter, and meat at a safe temperature through even the hottest part of a Virginia summer, functioning as the only reliable cold storage a farm family had access to for generations. The difference between food that spoiled within a day and food that kept for a week. Hundreds of them once dotted that valley, tucked into low ground near a reliable spring on nearly every working farm of any real size, small stone buildings that rarely made it into any history book, but that, in their own quiet way, kept whole families fed. Most were abandoned once electric refrigeration made them unnecessary sometime in the middle of the last century, left to the weather, and eventually to whatever vegetation found the damp shaded ground around a spring especially inviting, a slow erasure that took decades rather than years, one growing season at a time, until nobody left in the county could say for certain where a given spring had once been. Briar and bramble find exactly that kind of low, damp ground irresistible. Blackberry cane and multiflora rose spread aggressively into any opening, damp, low ground especially, rooting wherever a cane tip touches soil, and sending up new growth from a network of canes that thickens every single season it goes unmanaged. Left unmanaged for decades, they do not simply grow over a small stone building. They eventually swallow it so completely that a person can walk within a few feet of solid stone walls and see nothing but a green, thorny mound, indistinguishable from the surrounding hillside. The building itself no longer registering as a building at all to anyone passing by. Here is why goats succeeded where nothing else on that parcel ever had. And it is the whole reason a herd of browsing livestock ended up doing archaeological work nobody had hired them to do. A goat is a browser, not a grazer. An animal built by both instinct and physical preference to eat woody, brushy, thorny vegetation rather than open pasture grass. The opposite of what a cow or a sheep will choose given the option between the two. A distinction any experienced goat keeper learns to expect within the first few weeks of owning a herd. Turned loose on ground thick with bramble, a goat will walk straight past perfectly good grass to reach a thorny cane most other livestock would avoid entirely, stripping leaves and green growth methodically, working from the ground up and rising onto its hind legs to reach canes well above head height that a grazing animal could never touch at all, balancing against a cane or a low branch with a patience that looks almost deliberate, sometimes holding the pose for a full minute, working through a single stubborn stem. That repeated defoliation is what actually kills bramble over time, not a single pass, but months and years of it, season stacked on season. A blackberry cane or a multiflora rose bush survives being cut or mowed because its root system holds enough stored energy to send up new growth the following season, the same way kudzu does, shrugging off a single year's mechanical clearing as a minor inconvenience rather than a real threat. But a plant browse down to bare wood again and again, every time it tries to leaf out and rebuild its energy reserves, is slowly starved from the root up. It cannot photosynthesize enough to recover between browsing cycles, and after enough seasons of that pressure, the root crown itself finally gives out, unable to fund one more attempt at regrowth, the whole plant simply running out of stored energy it never had the chance to replace. Marta had not set out to prove any of that to anyone. She had simply kept the herd moving in loose rotation across the 71 acres the way Ezra always had, watching bare patches of ground slowly widen behind them season after season, thorny thickets thinning into low stubble, and then, eventually, into open ground she had not seen in 2 full years of walking that fence line. It did not happen without its share of small disasters along the way. The kind of thing that made the whole first year feel, in the moment, far less orderly than it actually was. A gate left unlatched one May sent 11 goats through a gap in a neighbor's fence and into a flower bed the neighbor had spent a full spring cultivating. An afternoon of frantic herding across 2 properties that ended with a great deal of apology. A replanted bed of hostas Marta paid for out of pocket, without being asked twice, and a neighbor who was gracious about it in the moment, but brought it up, gently, at every chance encounter, for the better part of a year afterward, usually with a small smile that made clear she had long since forgiven it, and simply enjoyed the story too much to let it go. A young buck got his horns wedged in an old length of collapsed wire fencing buried in the brush, invisible until he found it the hard way while working through a particularly stubborn patch of cane, and took the better part of a morning and 2 neighbors with wire cutters to free, without injuring either the animal or the men working around him in the thorns. One particularly stubborn nanny goat developed a habit of testing every new section of temporary fencing within an hour of it going up, walking the perimeter methodically until she found the one weak point Marta had somehow missed, forcing Marta to rebuild the same stretch of paddock 3 separate times before she finally found a configuration the animal could not defeat. A small, ongoing battle of wits that Marta privately admitted. More than once, she was not always entirely winning. A late frost one spring killed off a full paddock of young kids before Marta had properly weatherproofed the shelter closest to the low, damp corner of the property. A loss that had nothing directly to do with the brush clearing itself, but that still cost her a hard week of grief and second-guessing whether she had taken on more responsibility than she could actually manage alone, out there with no one else depending on the operation to succeed. And more than once that first summer, a full day's work moving the herd from one section to the next simply amounted to nothing when a sudden thunderstorm scattered the goats into the tree line, and Marta spent the rest of the evening counting heads by flashlight in the wet dark, coming up 1 or 2 short, until a familiar bleat somewhere off in the trees finally told her exactly where to look. None of it threatened the operation itself. It simply made that first full year feel, most weeks, like one long string of minor emergencies rather than the steady, quiet progress it actually was underneath all the noise, a distinction Marta herself did not fully appreciate until she looked back on it from the far side of the second season. The rain that finally exposed the springhouse came in April, a hard, sustained storm that dropped several inches over 2 days and sent sheet water running down every slope in that corner of the county roads closing in low spots, and the creek at the bottom of the valley running higher and browner than Marta had seen it in the 2 years she had been running that lease. The goats had already stripped that particular section bare the previous autumn, working through the last stubborn stand of cane over several patient weeks, leaving nothing behind but dead cane stubble and a thin covering of loose soil and leaf litter that 2 days of driving rain simply carried away, the way rain will carry away anything with no living root system left to hold it in place against that kind of pressure. Marta found it on a Tuesday morning, walking the fence line the way she did most mornings, coffee in hand, checking water troughs and counting heads out of habit more than necessity by that point in the lease. A routine she could have walked half asleep after 2 full years of it. She stopped cold at the sight of squared gray stone, where there had been nothing but a low, unremarkable rise in the ground the week before, a shape her eye had walked past 100 times without ever once registering it as anything other than part of the hillside itself. She set the coffee down on a fence post and did not pick it back up for the better part of an hour, standing perfectly still in a way none of her goats, moving and grazing around her, seemed to find remarkable at all. She spent that whole day just standing there, looking at it, running her hand along mortar joints, laid by somebody who had died a very long time before she was born, tracing the outline of a doorway still faintly visible in the stonework, before she ever thought to call anyone at all about what she had found. What followed was quieter than she expected. She mentioned it to a few neighbors, who came by out of simple curiosity over the following weeks, and admired the stonework the way people admire any well-built old thing, standing at the doorway and guessing aloud about who might have built it and when, trading half-remembered family stories about which farm had once run down to that low corner of the county. Word drifted as far as the County Historical Society, whose one active volunteer, a retired school teacher, who had spent years cataloging what remained of the county's old farm structures on her own time and her own dime, drove out, took photographs from every angle she could manage, measured what she could of the walls with a cloth tape she kept in her car for exactly this purpose, and logged the structure in a local registry that perhaps a dozen people would ever look at in a given year, filed alongside barns and mills and other quiet, half-forgotten pieces of the valley's working history. Nobody from the county government came out to formally recognize anything at all. There was no ceremony, no plaque, no line item in a county budget acknowledging that a goat herd on an unsellable lease had uncovered a piece of the valley's own history that had been sitting forgotten under the brush for the better part of a century. The county, as far as Marta could ever tell, never fully registered that any of it had happened at all, still listing the parcel in its own records the same way it always had. 71 acres of marginal, unsold ground. A description that had stopped being entirely accurate the moment the goats finished their work in that corner, but that nobody in an office anywhere had any particular reason to update. Marta did not mind the silence from the courthouse the way she might once have expected to, at least not for long. The spring house stands clear now, roof mostly gone, but the stone walls sound. Goats grazing loose bramble regrowth around its base the way they always have, keeping the ground open through nothing more than the same patient habit that uncovered it in the first place. On a clear morning, she can walk that same fence line, coffee in hand, and see the whole low corner of the property open and green, where 2 years earlier there had been nothing visible at all, but a wall of thorns nobody, including her, had ever expected to hide anything worth finding. The outline of the old doorway catching the early light in a way. That still, most mornings, stops her for a moment before she moves on to check the water troughs and start the rest of her day. Have you ever uncovered something valuable simply by doing the slow, patient work nobody else wanted to bother with in the first place? Tell us in the comments. We read every single one. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe and let us know where you are watching from tonight.